My father stood at the front of the church, microphone in hand, and told 60 people that I had wasted my life. I know because Mrs. Hendricks called me that same Sunday afternoon. She was whispering into the phone like she was delivering classified information, and maybe she was. "Sweetheart," she said, "your daddy got up during testimony time and said you were a cautionary tale." She paused. He used those exact words. Cautionary tale. I was sitting in my apartment in Atlanta, still in my work clothes, eating reheated pasta. I had just closed a deal worth $400,000. My phone had 3 congratulation texts from my business partner and 1 from my lawyer. And somewhere 3 hours away in Millbrook, Georgia, my father was telling the congregation of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church that I had turned my back on God, family, and common sense. I held the phone against my ear for a long time after Mrs. Hendricks finished talking. I was not crying. I was not angry. I was something quieter and more dangerous than either. I was done. But to understand why that moment was the last one, you need to understand every moment that came before it. 'Cause this did not start in a church. It started in a kitchen 26 years ago when I was 6 years old, and I learned that in the Caldwell house, love had a condition attached to it. And that condition had a name. His name was Marcus. Marcus Caldwell is my older brother by 4 years. He is the first thing my parents talk about when they meet someone new. He is the photograph on the mantle, the name dropped into conversation like a blessing, the son my father built his entire personality around. Marcus played football in high school, and the whole town acted like he was going to the NFL. He didn't. He threw out his knee junior year, and that was the end of that. But somehow, in my father's memory, Marcus still plays that game on Friday nights, still catches that pass, still hears the crowd. My name is Cassandra Caldwell. I go by Cassie. I am 32 years old. I run a financial consulting firm in Atlanta with 12 clients and 3 employees and a corner office that looks out over Midtown. And for most of my life, not one person in my immediate family thought any of that was impressive. Here is what I mean. The year I graduated top of my class at the University of Georgia, Marcus got promoted to assistant manager at a car dealership in Millbrook. My parents threw him a dinner party. I got a card in the mail with a $20 bill inside and a post-it that said, "Proud of you, don't forget where you came from." My mother's handwriting. The year I passed my certified financial planner exam on the first try, a score only about 30% of candidates manage, my father called to tell me Marcus had been named volunteer coach for the Pee Wee Football League. He talked for 9 minutes. I timed it. He asked about my exam for about 45 seconds, then said, "That's real good, Cassie, but I don't really understand what you do." He never tried to understand. That was the thing. It was not that my father was stupid. He understood plenty of things. He understood football stats and engine mechanics and the entire plot of every John Grisham novel. He just chose not to understand me because understanding me would have required rearranging a story he had already decided on. The story was simple. Marcus was the one who mattered. I was the one who had ideas above her raising. That phrase, ideas above her raising. My mother used it first when I was 12 and told her I wanted to go to college out of state. She looked at me across the dinner table like I had suggested something obscene and said, "Girl, don't go getting ideas above your raising." My father nodded. Marcus laughed. I ate my green beans and made a private promise to myself that I was going to go as far above my raising as humanly possible. I kept that promise. But it cost me more than I expected. Church was the center of our family's social life in Millbrook, the way it is in a lot of small southern towns. Grace Fellowship Baptist was where my parents were married, where Marcus and I were baptized, where my grandmother's funeral was held, where everyone who knew everyone went every Sunday morning and most Wednesday evenings. My father was a deacon. My mother sang in the choir. We were a church family. That meant appearances mattered twice as much as they did everywhere else because God was supposedly watching, but more importantly, so were the neighbors. When I was 16, I started asking questions my father didn't like. Not about faith exactly. About fairness. About why Marcus got to stay out until midnight but my curfew was 10. About why my grades, which were straight A's, got less conversation than Marcus's C+ average, which my father called good enough for a boy who works hard. About why I was expected to help my mother with every church event while Marcus sat in the back with the other boys and watched. My father's answer was always some version of the same thing. That's just how it is. Or you'll understand when you're older. Or the one I hated most. Don't make everything a whole thing, Cassie. Making it a whole thing was his way of saying, stop noticing. Stop naming it. Just absorb it quietly like you're supposed to. I stopped arguing out loud. But I never stopped noticing. The summer before my senior year of high school, I got a part-time job at a bank branch in town, filing paperwork and answering phones. The branch manager, a woman named Diane Okafor, was the sharpest person I had ever met up close. She wore perfectly pressed blazers and asked questions that cut right to the center of things. She noticed me hovering near the loan documents one afternoon, and instead of shooing me away, she pulled up a chair and started explaining how interest rates worked. I stayed 2 hours past my shift listening. That was the moment I understood what I wanted to do with my life. Not just handle money. Understand it. Understand the systems behind it. Understand why some families built wealth and others didn't, why some people spent 40 years working and had nothing to show for it, why a piece of paper signed the right way or the wrong way could change everything. I went home and told my parents I wanted to study finance. My father looked up from the television. Like teller work? No, I said. Financial planning. Investment strategy. I want to help people build wealth. He turned back to the TV. That sounds like something for people with connections. You know anybody like that? My mother said. There's always accounting at the community college, Cassie. That's a steady job. I got into UGA on a partial academic scholarship. I figured out the rest with loans and work study and 3 part-time jobs my sophomore year. My parents came to my graduation, which I will give them credit for. But on the drive home, my father's main observation was that Marcus had just gotten a raise at the dealership and was thinking about buying a house. I nodded and looked out the window and thought about the job offer I had already accepted in Atlanta. I did not tell them about it until 2 weeks before I left. First 3 years in Atlanta were the hardest and the best. Hard because I was building from scratch with no family money, no safety net, and no one to call when the loneliness of a new city pressed in at night. Best because for the first time in my life, no one was measuring me against someone else. I was just a person who showed up early and worked late and slowly, steadily earned the trust of people who had no reason to give it to me otherwise. I started at a mid-size wealth management firm as a junior analyst. I was the only black woman in my department. I made note of that and decided it would not stop me, but I also decided I would never pretend it wasn't there. Pretending things weren't there was something I had done enough of growing up. I learned everything I could. I volunteered for the complicated cases. I stayed late. I asked questions that other junior analysts were too proud or too careful to ask. My first big client was a retired postal worker named Howard who had saved diligently his whole life but had no idea how to make that savings work for him in retirement. I spent twice as many hours on his account as the firm required. When I restructured his portfolio, he made enough in the first year to pay off his daughter's student loans. Howard cried when I told him. He shook my hand and said, "Young lady, you changed my family." I drove home that night and sat in my car for 20 minutes because I needed a minute to feel it, to understand that I had done something real, something that mattered. Something my father's version of me, the cautionary tale, the girl with ideas above her raising, could never have done. 2 years later, I left the firm and started my own practice. I want to be clear about something. I did not do this to prove anything to my family. I did it because I was good at it and because I loved it and because I had spent enough of my life waiting for someone to tell me I was allowed to go further. I decided to stop waiting. But I would be lying if I said the voice in the back of my head was completely silent. The voice that sounded like my father saying, "That's something for people with connections." I heard it every time I almost lost a client, every time a deal fell through, every time I sat across from someone in a boardroom and felt the particular quiet before they decided whether or not to trust me. I heard it. And I worked harder. The calls home got shorter over the years. Not because I stopped trying, but because every conversation followed the same pattern. I would share something about my work. My mother would say, "That's nice." My father would pivot to Marcus. Marcus had bought a house. Marcus had gotten engaged. Marcus and his wife were expecting. Marcus was thinking about running for city council. I sent a card for every milestone. Called on birthdays. I drove down for Thanksgiving most years and sat at the table and listened to Marcus talk and watched my father beam and told myself this was fine, this was just family, this was just how some things were. But things were not fine. They were just quiet. And then came the Sunday that Mrs. Hendricks called me. I found out later exactly what my father said. A few people in the congregation confirmed it, and one person, I will not say who, sent me a handwritten note apologizing on behalf of the church. Apparently, my father had stood up during open testimony, the part of the service where members share what God had been doing in their lives, and he had used most of his time to talk about the dangers of ambition without roots. He said that some young people left their families chasing money and forgot that God and community were what mattered. He said that watching that happen in his own home had been a burden he carried every day. He said he prayed for his daughter regularly, that he hoped she would find her way back before it was too late. He did not say my name. He didn't have to. Everyone in that building had known me since I was in the children's choir wearing a white robe 3 sizes too big. I thought about calling him. I picked up the phone 4 times that evening. Each time I put it back down. 'Cause I knew what would happen. He would tell me I was being too sensitive. He would say he was just sharing from his heart. He would ask why I always had to make everything a whole thing. And I would do what I had done my whole life. I would absorb it. I would say, "Okay, Daddy." I would hang up and sit alone in my apartment and feel smaller than I was. I was 32 years old. I had 12 clients and 3 employees and a corner office in Midtown Atlanta. I was done feeling small. So instead of calling, I opened my laptop and started working. And what I worked on changed everything. There is a project I have been thinking about for almost 2 years. A financial literacy program for underserved communities. Not charity. Not a tax write-off. An actual program. Saturday workshops, one-on-one coaching sessions, a curriculum I designed myself based on everything Diane Okafor had taught me in that bank branch in Millbrook all those years ago, combined with everything I had learned in the decades since. I had been waiting for the right moment to launch it. Or maybe, if I am honest, I had been waiting to feel like I had enough permission, enough success, enough proof that I was real before I tried to do something that size. That Sunday night, I decided I was done waiting for permission. I also decided something else. Grace Fellowship Baptist Church in Millbrook, Georgia had a community outreach fund. I knew about it because my mother had mentioned it over the years. It helped families in the congregation with emergency expenses, medical bills, utility shutoffs, funeral costs. It ran on donations and it was always underfunded. I made a donation. I will not tell you the exact amount, but I will tell you it was enough that the pastor, Reverend Darren Ellis, a man I had known since I was 7 years old, called my father 11 days later. I know it was 11 days because my father called me that evening and I counted backward to the Sunday when Mrs. Hendricks had called me. 11 days. My phone rang at 8:45 in the evening. I was reviewing a client report. I saw my father's name and felt the familiar tightening in my chest that his calls still produced after all these years. I answered anyway. "Cassie." His voice was different. I noticed it immediately. There was none of the usual comfortable authority in it. None of the ease that comes from a man who has never been surprised by his own daughter. "Hey, Daddy." A pause that lasted longer than it should have. I just got off the phone with Reverend Ellis. Okay. Another pause. He said the church received a significant donation for the community fund. He stopped. He said it came from you. I did not say anything. He said it was the largest single donation the fund had ever received. My father's voice was doing something complicated. I had never heard it do that before. He said he wanted me to know personally, because he thought I should hear it from him before people started talking. That was kind of him, I said. Silence. And then, quietly, Cassie, why didn't you tell us things were going this well? And there it was. Question that contained every other question. The one that really meant, who are you? When did you become this? How did I miss it? I took a breath. I thought about 12 years of cards sent and calls made and tables sat at and stories told to people who changed the subject. I thought about 60 people in a church building hearing the word cautionary tale attached to my name. Daddy, I said, I've been telling you for years. Silence. I told you when I started the firm. I told you when I hired my first employee. I told you when I got featured in the Atlanta Business Chronicle. I emailed you the link. I didn't know what that was. You didn't ask. The silence this time was different. Heavy in a specific way that told me something was happening on the other end of the line. Something that didn't happen often with my father. Something that looked maybe like reckoning. I said something at church, he said finally. A few Sundays ago. I know. You know. Mrs. Hendricks called me. He exhaled. A long, slow sound. Cassie, You don't have to explain it, I said. I know why you said it. I've always known. And that was true. It was never a mystery. My father had needed me to be smaller because my being bigger than the story he told about our family disrupted something in him that he didn't have the language to name. Reverend Ellis asked if you might be willing to come speak, my father said. At the church. About financial literacy. He said he's been wanting to start something like that for the congregation for years and he thinks you'd be. He stopped. I could hear him searching for the word. He thinks you'd be perfect. I looked out my office window at the Atlanta skyline. The lights were coming on as the evening darkened, that particular hour when the city stops looking like a place you work and starts looking like a place that exists for its own reasons, indifferent and enormous and full of possibility. I thought about the 6-year-old girl who sat at a kitchen table eating green beans and making promises to herself. I thought about the bank branch and Diane Okafor's blazer and Howard the postal worker crying in my office. I thought about 12 years of being a cautionary tale to people who never asked a single question about what I was actually building. I'll think about it, I said. My father was quiet for a moment. Then, your mother would like you to come for dinner sometime. No occasion. Just dinner. I'll think about that too. I said goodnight. I hung up. And I sat in my chair in my corner office for a long time, not because I was sad, not because I was angry, not even because I was satisfied, though I was all of those things a little. I sat there because I needed a minute to understand what had just shifted. My father had not apologized. Not really. He had not said, I was wrong about you. I should have listened. I should have asked. I wasted years. He had not said any of that, and I did not expect him to. Men like my father do not apologize the way other people do. They pivot. They find a side door. They say, would you like to come to dinner, and they mean it as the closest thing to sorry they know how to build. I knew all of that. And I also knew that something had changed anyway. Not everything. Not all at once. But the version of me that existed in his mind, the cautionary tale, the daughter with ideas above her raising, that version had been replaced by something he could not explain away or minimize. Something real. Something that had walked into his church and changed the number on a ledger sheet and made his pastor call him personally to say, your daughter. Not a cautionary tale. His daughter. I did go to dinner. About 3 weeks after that phone call, I drove down on a Saturday and sat at the same kitchen table and ate my mother's pot roast and listened to Marcus talk about his plans to expand the dealership and watched my father watch me differently than he ever had before. He asked me a question about my work. An actual question specific about how I advised clients on retirement planning. I answered it. He listened. He did not change the subject. It was not a transformation. I want to be clear about that because I think people sometimes expect these stories to end with a parent standing up and saying, "I see you now, I was wrong about everything, I love you the way I should have loved you all along." That would be clean and satisfying, and it would also be a lie. What I got was a father who asked one real question at dinner, who sat with the answer instead of looking for an exit, who, when I stood up to leave, walked me to my car and stood on the front porch in the evening air and said, "Drive safe, Cass." I mean it. He had said drive safe 1,000 times in my life. But this time the 2 words after it were new. I mean it. Like he wanted me to know the instruction was real. Like he wanted me to know he needed me to arrive somewhere to continue to exist in the world in the way I had been existing without his knowledge or his blessing for 12 years. It was small. It was imperfect. It was something. I drove back to Atlanta in the dark with the radio low and thought about what I wanted. Not from my father. Not from my family. What I wanted, period. What came next? I spoke at Grace Fellowship the following month. A Saturday morning financial literacy workshop. 43 people showed up. I talked for 2 hours about budgeting and savings and compound interest and how to read a credit report and why the wealth gap exists and what individual families can do in spite of systemic disadvantages that are real and documented and not their fault. My mother was in the front row. My father sat 3 rows back, next to Marcus, who looked bored for the first part and then gradually stopped looking bored. The end, a woman named Brenda who had been in the congregation since before I was born came up and took my hand in both of hers. She said, "Baby, I have been doing everything wrong for 30 years and nobody ever told me in plain English until today." I thought about Howard crying in my office. I thought about Diane Okafor pulling up a chair next to a 16-year-old girl and deciding her curiosity was worth an afternoon. I thought about every person who had shown me at some point in my life that someone else's growth was worth their time. And I thought about how many people I had access to right now. Right here. In this room and in every room like it. After the workshop, Reverend Ellis pulled me aside and asked if I would consider making it a monthly program. I said yes before he finished the sentence. On the way to my car, my father fell into step beside me. We walked for a moment without talking. The Georgia sun was doing that warm October thing where the light is golden and sideways and makes everything look like a painting. "You were good in there," he said. I kept walking. "Thank you, Daddy." "I mean it," he said again. Those same 2 words. "You were really good." I did not say, "I know." I did not say, "I've been good for a long time and you missed it." I did not say any of the things I might have said 5 years ago, 3 years ago, even 1 year ago. I just said, "I'm going to keep doing it." And he nodded. Like that was the right answer. Like maybe he had always known this was in me and just needed to be shown the proof in a language he could finally read. We said goodbye in the parking lot. I got in my car. I did not look in the rearview mirror when I pulled out. Not because I was angry. 'Cause I was looking forward. I had places to be. There is something I want to say to anyone who recognizes themselves in this story. Anyone who grew up in a house where love was distributed unevenly, where your achievements were a footnote and someone else's were the whole story, where you were told, directly or indirectly, that wanting more was the same as being ungrateful. You do not need their revision of you to be real. You are already real. Clients who trust you are real. The work you have done is real. The life you built in the spaces they refuse to look is real. People sometimes come back. Not always. Not always fully. Not always the way you needed them to when it would have mattered most. But sometimes they stand in a parking lot on a golden October afternoon and say I mean it in a way they never said it before, and that small thing lands differently than you expected. Does not fix everything. It is not supposed to. It just means the story is still being written. I drove back to Atlanta. I had a client call Monday morning and a new workshop curriculum to finish and an office that looked out over a city I had chosen and built myself in. My father had called me a cautionary tale. 60 people heard it. 11 days later, the pastor called him. And the woman he warned them about was the one filling in the blank he had left. That is not revenge. That is just what happens when you refuse to become what someone else decided you were. That is just what happens when you keep going anyway.